It was early March when I received the telegram. Written in curt language and bearing an official seal, it summoned me across continents to Korea. The message was brief: 10 missing. Rural village. Supernatural implications. Immediate assistance required. Do not ignore this. My line of work rarely brought in casual calls for help. I was the investigator one called when they'd exhausted all logical possibilities and stumbled into the absurd. The strange and terrifying world of the occult. The village, Hanbayan, was remote, nestled near the Siraxan Mountains. At first glance, it seemed like a place untouched by time, where the mountains watched over silent valleys. Yet, the villagers knew better. They lived in constant unease, their folklore a protective warning. 10 missing. I asked a grim-faced officer named Jin-ho, who met me at the edge of town. Jin-ho didn't answer immediately. He turned to scan the road behind him, as if ensuring we weren't being overheard. They're not just missing. They were taken. His voice dropped to a whisper. The villagers believe it's a Tengu. I paused mid-step, the chill in the air deepening. I knew the word. In Japanese folklore, the Tengu was a fearsome spirit, a mountain-dwelling yokai with sharp claws, wings, and a beak, sometimes depicted as a bird of prey, sometimes with the twisted features of a human monk. But this wasn't Japan. I raised an eyebrow. Tengu. Here. Jin-ho nodded gravely. The legend came with them, a mix of their stories and ours. They say the Tengu isn't just a spirit of the mountain anymore. It's something worse. The first thing I noticed about Hanbayan was the silence. Villages are supposed to be filled with life, children running, dogs barking, the chime of tools in motion. Instead, the air was heavy, as though the entire village held its breath. The streets were empty, save for Jin-ho and me. They're afraid to come out after dark, he muttered as we passed a closed-up tea shop. The first disappearance happened at night. Who was first? A farmer named Baeksu, Jin-ho replied, leading me toward the center of the village. He was walking back from the fields. His lantern was found smashed in the dirt, and his footprints ended halfway across the path. As if he was plucked from the earth itself. The description nagged at me, curling deep in my mind. And the others? Jin-ho grimaced. Similar. The blacksmith's son vanished on the riverbank, his fishing rod left untouched. A group of 3 travelers disappeared after taking shelter here for a night. People swear they hear wings flapping in the dead of night. Others see shadows above the rooftops. Wings. Shadows. These details aligned a little too neatly with the Tengu myth. But folklore rarely told the whole story. I set up shop in the abandoned schoolhouse. It seemed the safest place, centrally located and solid. That night, villagers hesitantly visited me one by one, their faces shadowed by fear. They told their stories in hushed tones. They take those who wander, one elderly woman rasped, her hands trembling as she held a string of wooden beads. Those who stray from the path. Those who dare disrespect the mountain. A younger man spoke of seeing the Tengu's face in the trees. It wasn't human. It had red eyes, burning eyes. I ran. I didn't look back. As I catalogued their accounts, I felt a pattern forming. The victims were always isolated, alone, vulnerable. And the attacks grew more aggressive. The clock ticked toward midnight when Jin-ho returned to the schoolhouse. His face was pale. "Detective Graves," he said quietly, "we found something, in the forest." "Show me." The forest lay a mile from the village, its ancient trees arching overhead like skeletal fingers. We trudged in silence, the wind whipping through the branches, creating a sound that could almost pass for laughter. "It's up ahead," Jin-ho said. We found it in a small clearing, a crude shrine of sorts. At the center lay a pile of feathers, blackened and slick with some foul-smelling liquid. Around it were dozens of carvings, horrid masks hewn from wood. They bore grotesque features, contorted into screams or smirks. But what struck me most was the smell, a mix of rot and blood. This wasn't made by hands unfamiliar with ritual, I murmured, crouching beside the shrine. Is it witchcraft? Jin-ho whispered. I shook my head slowly. This is older. Something tied to the land. I picked up one of the masks, brushing the muck from its surface. Beneath the grime, its design hit me like a thunderclap, sharp, angular lines, resembling a bird's beak. Tengu. The villagers weren't simply paranoid. Something was here. Jin-ho stepped closer, but his foot snapped a twig. The sound echoed unnaturally through the trees, and in that instant, the forest stilled. Not a bird. Not an insect. Only silence. And then, far above us, a low, guttural cry pierced the night. Jin-ho's eyes widened. It's here. From above, I heard it, whoosh, the unmistakable sound of wings cutting through the air. I spun, trying to find the source, but the canopy was too thick. Shadows flitted between branches, and the awful cry repeated, closer this time. Jin-ho raised his lantern, but the flame flickered wildly as though protesting the darkness itself. Suddenly, the wind picked up, a vortex of freezing air that howled like a living thing. The shrine behind us burst apart, the wooden masks flying as if hurled by invisible hands. It's angry. Jin-ho shouted. A shape darted across the moonlit sky, black, massive, and fast. It moved like no bird I'd ever seen. Its wings seemed too large for its body, and its silhouette bent unnaturally, twisting in midair. Then, with a deafening screech, it dove straight for us. I barely had time to shout a warning before the shape descended on us. Jin-ho stumbled back, his lantern shattering against a rock. The light extinguished instantly, leaving us in a void of darkness punctuated only by the whoosh of massive wings. I grabbed Jin-ho's arm, dragging him out of the clearing. We crashed through underbrush, the sharp thorns clawing at our skin. Behind us, something massive tore at the trees, breaking branches as easily as a man might snap twigs. Its screech echoed across the woods, rattling my bones like a tuning fork struck too hard. What is that thing? Jin-ho shouted as we ran. Keep moving. I growled, pushing forward. I'd seen creatures of folklore brought to life before, but this was something far more visceral. It felt as though the land itself recoiled in terror at its presence. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the trees and into the village's edge. Panting, I turned back toward the forest. The clearing behind us was silent once more, but not empty. Up in the branches, red eyes watched us. Burning, hateful, and unblinking. Jin-ho's hands trembled as he lit another lantern back at the abandoned schoolhouse. You saw it, didn't you? I nodded grimly. It's no ghost story, officer. The villagers weren't wrong, something very real is hunting them. He swallowed hard. What do we do? First, we need to know why, I replied. Folklore doesn't exist without reason. Someone must have disturbed something, or called it. Jin-ho blinked. Called it? Summoned it, I clarified. Creatures like this don't just appear. They're tied to a wrong done, a balance upset, or some ritual. We need to dig into the village's history. At first light, we spoke to the headman, an elderly man named Min-suk. His face was lined like aged paper, and his gaze darted to every shadow, as though fearing it might sprout talons. We know about the Tengu, I told him firmly. But we need to know what the village has been hiding. 10 people didn't just disappear. What happened before the first? Min-suk's hands tightened around the cane he held. It's not for outsiders to know. I stepped closer, my voice low but hard. You called me here because you want this to stop. If you don't speak, then more will disappear. What did you awaken? The old man's eyes shone with something between anger and guilt. Slowly, he began to speak. 2 months ago, he said, his voice trembling, a group of men from the village entered the sacred forest to cut timber. It is forbidden to touch the trees beyond the black rock, ancient spirits guard that place. Jin-ho stiffened beside me. They knew this was forbidden. They were desperate, Min-suk admitted. Winter was cruel this year, and firewood was scarce. I warned them. I begged them. But they didn't listen. And now the village pays the price, I muttered. I glanced at Jin-ho. It's not just a Tengu anymore. This thing has been twisted by anger, a curse. Min-suk nodded gravely. If you saw its face, then you know it cannot be bargained with. Then we'll have to stop it, I said firmly. How? Jin-ho asked, his voice cracking. I thought of the shrine in the woods and the masks carved to resemble the monster. I had dealt with curses before, and they always followed one truth: a curse must be undone where it began. Jin-ho gathered supplies while I pored over my journal of occult notes. I thumbed through pages of curses, Tengu legends, and mountain spirits, trying to piece together a solution. The Tengu, in its original lore, was sometimes a protector, a punisher of arrogance or those who defiled sacred places. But here in Hanbayan, the legend had evolved into something much darker. This Tengu fed on fear. It hunted those who strayed, growing stronger with each life taken. We need to return to the shrine, I told Jin-ho as he packed salt, iron knives, and a small pouch of protective herbs. If this started with the men who cut those trees, the shrine holds the key. We have to perform a reversal. Reversal? Jin-ho looked skeptical. A ritual to sever the connection between this spirit and the land, I explained. It won't be easy, but it's our only option. Armed with lanterns, talismans, and whatever courage we could muster, we set off toward the forest again. The forest felt heavier this time. Each step took effort, as though the ground itself resisted us. Jin-ho muttered prayers under his breath, his hands clutching the lantern so tightly his knuckles turned white. Are you sure about this, Detective Graves? No, I replied honestly. But waiting won't save anyone. We reached the clearing, and the shattered shrine lay before us, a smoldering scar of feathers, wood, and dark energy. I crouched beside it and began tracing symbols into the dirt, words muttered low in languages older than memory. Light the salt lines, I told Jin-ho. They'll form a barrier. He nodded, scattering salt in wide circles around the shrine's remains before lighting small candles. The flames flickered and hissed as though they burned something unseen. Now what? Jin-ho whispered. We finished the ritual, I said, pulling a small dagger from my coat. I pricked my finger, letting a few drops of blood hit the center of the shrine. Blood, a link between man and spirit. A connection to heal or to sever. The moment the blood touched the earth, the forest screamed. The trees bent inward as though they were watching us. A violent wind howled through the clearing, snuffing out all but 2 of the candles. Graves! Jin-ho shouted, his voice panicked. It's coming. From the treetops above, I heard it again, the whoosh of wings. Something black and massive detached itself from the shadows, circling above us. Its eyes gleamed red like molten coals. It knows what we're doing. I shouted. Keep the barrier intact. The Tengu dove, its talons outstretched, tearing through the air like a black blade. Jin-ho dropped to the ground, covering his head as the creature slammed into the earth, mere feet from the salt circle. For the first time, I saw it clearly. It stood over 8 feet tall, its body a horrifying blend of man and bird. Its wings sprouted from its back, feathers matted with grime and blood. Its face was the worst, a mask-like visage, beak-shaped and grotesque, but its eyes, those burning red eyes, spoke of endless hatred. It shrieked, the sound rattling through my skull like nails on glass. I tightened my grip on the dagger and stepped forward. "You don't belong here," I said firmly, the words of the ritual forming on my lips. The Tengu hissed, its body twitching unnaturally as it advanced toward me, but it couldn't cross the salt. Its claws scraped against the invisible barrier, sparks flying as it roared in frustration. "Graves, hurry!" Jinho shouted. The Tengu thrashed against the invisible wall of salt and ritual symbols, its screeches echoing through the clearing like thunder trapped in a cage. Each claw swipe sent sparks skittering across the ground, and I could feel the pressure of its presence pushing against my chest, like standing in the eye of a storm. Jinho knelt near the edge of the circle, clutching his rifle in shaking hands. "Graves! The salt, it's breaking." He was right. The creature's rage was taking its toll. One of the salt lines had been kicked apart by the flurry of wind and claws. The protective barrier was fractured. The Tengu sensed it, too. It fell still for a brief moment, its glowing red eyes fixing on me. Then, with unnatural speed, it lunged forward, partially crossing the boundary. Its talons slammed into the dirt just feet from where I stood. "No!" I roared, shoving Jinho back. I dropped to my knees, pulling a fresh pouch of salt from my coat and tossing a handful into the breach. The air hissed and crackled as the barrier reformed, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. "We need to finish the ritual, now," I shouted. "Keep it distracted." "What? Distract that?" Jinho yelled, his eyes wide with panic. "Shoot it. Do something." Jinho hesitated only a moment before raising his rifle. He fired 2 shots into the creature's torso. The bullets tore through feathers and flesh, but the Tengu barely flinched. Instead, it turned its head toward Jinho, its beak twisting into something grotesquely resembling a grin. It laughed. A deep, grating sound that scraped the inside of my skull. "Keep shooting," I barked, returning to the ritual. I spoke the incantation louder this time, forcing each word into the clearing as though driving nails into the earth. "By this blood, this land, and this breath, I sever the bond. I cast you back." The Tengu screeched in fury, the sound so piercing that my ears rang. The ground beneath us trembled, the forest itself seeming to groan in protest. Branches whipped violently overhead as the wind swirled into a vortex of dust and shadow. From the corner of my eye, I saw Jinho reload, his hands slick with sweat and trembling. "Graves, it's pushing through again." The barrier cracked, splintering like glass. The Tengu shoved its beak and a clawed hand forward, reaching for me. I had seconds. Time slowed. I clutched the bloodied dagger in my hand, my mind racing. The incantation had almost been completed, but it wasn't enough. This creature's fury had anchored it to the land too deeply. I needed more. A sacrifice. "Graves." Jinho's voice pulled me back to reality. The Tengu's claw swept toward me like a black scythe. At the last possible moment, I drove the dagger into my own palm, forcing more blood onto the ground. "I offer." I shouted into the chaos, my voice raw. "Let this bond end. Take this blood and be banished." For one horrific instant, everything fell silent. The Tengu froze, its burning eyes locking onto me. Its beak twisted again, this time in a look of understanding. "Graves," Jinho whispered. The creature tilted its head. Then, as though my offering had satisfied it, it let out one final shriek, a sound that reverberated through the earth itself. The clearing erupted in a shockwave of wind and light, throwing both Jinho and me backward. I landed hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. My ears rang, my vision blurred, but I forced myself to sit up. The clearing was empty. The Tengu was gone. Jinho stumbled to his feet, staring at the scorched earth where the shrine had been. "Is it over?" I held up my bleeding hand and looked around the clearing. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest was lifting, like fog dispersing at dawn. For now, I said quietly. But the land will remember. By the time we returned to the village, dawn was breaking. The sun spilled golden light over the rooftops, a stark contrast to the nightmare we'd just endured. The villagers emerged cautiously, their eyes wide with exhaustion and hope. They could feel it, too, the shift. The mountain's anger had ebbed, and the Tengu's shadow had retreated. Minsuk approached us, his cane tapping against the dirt. "Is it gone?" I nodded. "The spirit has been severed from this place. It won't take more." The old man sighed deeply, as though a weight had been lifted from his very soul. "You saved us. The village is in your debt." I held up my bandaged hand. "This wasn't without cost." "Nothing ever is," Minsuk murmured. The villagers gathered in the square, murmuring prayers of thanks to the mountain spirits and the ancestors. I watched them quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, that something lingered just beneath the surface. "Detective Graves," Jinho said, standing beside me. "That thing, it accepted your blood. What does that mean?" "It means," I said, staring back toward the forest, "that it's satisfied. For now." Jinho paled. "And if it returns?" I turned to him, my voice low. "Then I'll be back." As I boarded the bus that would take me out of Hanbayan, I couldn't stop myself from looking back one last time. The village stood quiet, nestled in the shadow of Siaraxen, but something about it felt changed. I pulled out my journal and wrote down my final notes. Tengu encountered. Spirit's power amplified by disturbed land, forbidden forest. Rituals severed the bond, but the cost, personal blood offering. I paused, tapping the pen against my lip. Something gnawed at me, a voice carried by the wind as I left the clearing. It had whispered my name. Elric. I glanced down at my bandaged palm, flexing the fingers gingerly. The wound throbbed, but the pain was dull now, almost familiar. Outside the window, the forest stretched endlessly, its dark canopy broken only by rays of sunlight. As the bus turned a bend, I thought I saw movement, something large and shadowy flitting between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. "Just the wind," I muttered. But deep down, I knew better. The bus jolted on uneven roads, its engine humming like a tired old beast. I leaned my head against the window, watching the forests of Siaraxen retreat into the distance. The sun was up now, bright and unapologetic, but its light didn't reach far enough to erase the unease that coiled in my chest. My hand throbbed beneath the bandages, the bloodied offering still fresh in my memory. I had dealt with curses before, things that clung to the earth, woven into the fabric of superstition and shadow, but this was different. This was personal. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my journal, thumbing back to a half-finished entry written years ago, notes I'd made about blood pacts and their consequences. An offering of one's own blood establishes a link. To sever a spirit is to bind it elsewhere. Energy cannot simply vanish, it must go somewhere. I frowned, feeling my pulse beat against the wound. Somewhere, in the deepest recesses of my mind, I swore I heard it again, a whisper. Elric. I sat up sharply, the sound of my name clear as a bell. I glanced around the bus. The driver hummed a tune beneath his breath. A young woman slept 2 seats ahead. Nothing else stirred. Just my imagination. Or so I told myself. By the time I reached Seoul, the bustling city felt like another world entirely, lights and crowds, cars and chatter. After days of isolation in Hanbayan, it was jarring. But even the chaos of the city couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I checked into a small guest house, the kind of place no one asks questions about your bruises or haunted expression. After a hot shower and several cups of bitter tea, I tried to push the forest's shadows from my mind. Then my phone rang. It was Jinho. His voice was taut, like a rope pulled too tight. Graves. Something's happened. What is it? I asked, my fingers tightening around the receiver. It's Min Suk, the village elder. He's dead. I froze. How? His family found him in his room early this morning, Jinho explained. His window was shattered. There were claw marks on the walls and, he hesitated. His body, Graves. He was torn apart. Just like the others. I exhaled slowly, fighting back a rising dread. Are you saying the Tengu returned? That's just it, Jinho said quietly. The villagers say they heard wings, but there was no sign of the creature. No feathers. No shadows. What else? The family swore they heard Min Suk whispering to himself before it happened, Jinho replied. He was saying your name. My blood ran cold. Jinho, I said firmly, I'm coming back. I arrived back in Hanbayan under the cover of night. The village was different now, more fractured, more afraid. Windows were shuttered tight, doors bolted. The narrow streets were empty, but I could sense eyes watching from the dark corners of houses. Jinho met me outside the ruined shrine, his face pale and worn. Graves. I don't know what's happening. You said the ritual severed the connection. It did, I said, crouching to examine the earth. The shrine was untouched, the salt circle still intact, though the air around it felt colder. But something remains. A fragment, maybe. A link I didn't destroy completely. Why Min Suk? Jinho asked. Because he was part of this, I replied. He knew the truth about the forest and the Tengu. He led the village, whether by guilt or ignorance, into breaking its covenant. This creature is vengeful, Jinho. It doesn't forgive easily. Jinho swallowed hard. Do you think it's after you? I didn't answer him. But in my gut, I already knew the truth. We turned toward the forest as the moon crept out from behind the clouds. It hung impossibly low and swollen in the sky, tinged red. A blood moon, Jinho whispered. The superstitious part of me felt it, too, like a pulse in the earth, a heartbeat too loud. Something was stirring. Something unfinished. We returned to Min Suk's house, the site of his death. The scent of blood still lingered, sickly sweet and metallic. I could feel its wrongness even as I crossed the threshold, a pressure in the air, like the village itself was holding its breath. The claw marks were fresh, carved deep into the wood around the shattered window. Whatever did this had entered without effort. I crouched near Min Suk's body, now covered by a thin shroud. Who found him? I asked Jinho. His granddaughter. She said he woke up screaming in the middle of the night, ranting about shadows and wings. I pulled back the shroud slightly. Min Suk's face was frozen in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. His hands were clutched tightly against his chest, his fingernails bloodied as though he'd been trying to claw something out of himself. I frowned. Something glinted in his grip. Help me, I said. Jinho helped pry open the old man's fingers. When we finally pulled his hands apart, a small object dropped onto the floor. It was a carved wooden mask. The same kind we'd found at the shrine. Jinho paled. Why was he holding this? I turned the mask over in my hands. He knew it wasn't over. It's not just a spirit, Jinho. It's a curse that infects. The men who cut those trees let it loose. My ritual weakened it, but it didn't destroy it. Instead, it latched onto me, and through me, it's spreading. Spreading? Jinho whispered. I nodded. It's using my blood, my link to the ritual, as a doorway. It's still hungry. Jinho and I gathered the villagers in the town square, though many were reluctant to come. Word of Min Suk's death had spread, and whispers of the cursed detective followed me like a shadow. You brought this thing back, someone accused, a middle-aged man with frightened eyes. I raised my voice, cutting through the murmurs. You all broke the covenant with the mountain. You disturbed something that was better left forgotten. I may have severed its grip, but a piece of it remains, and it's not just hunting me. It's hunting anyone tied to this land. The villagers grew quiet, their anger replaced by cold fear. Jinho stepped forward. We need to stop this. Together. How? An elderly woman whispered. If it's part of the land, how do we kill it? I thought for a long moment. We don't kill it. We trap it. Back in the forest? Jinho asked. Yes, I said. Where it began. The villagers looked horrified. No one wanted to return to that cursed place. But they had little choice. If the Tengu couldn't be bound, it would consume them all. I looked toward the dark outline of the forest, where the trees swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel. It was waiting for me. The forest swallowed us whole as we entered its depths for the last time. The villagers followed, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with fear. Some carried lanterns, others clutched talismans carved from wood or iron. Jinho walked beside me, his rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. This is madness, he whispered. Sometimes madness is the only way through, I replied grimly. Ahead of us, the trees twisted unnaturally, their branches clawing toward the blood moon like desperate hands. The deeper we walked, the heavier the air became, thick with the scent of rot and something old. The villagers muttered prayers under their breath, the words carried off by a wind that didn't belong. We reached the clearing, the ruined shrine exactly as I'd left it. Feathers still scattered the ground, stained dark with whatever foul magic had taken root here. In the center of it all, I could feel the Tengu's presence, watching. Waiting. I turned to the villagers. Make a circle, I said. Salt, iron, and lanterns. Nothing crosses it. Jinho began distributing the supplies. I knelt in the center of the shrine, pulling my dagger from my coat. The wound on my palm throbbed, as if the forest itself remembered my blood. This thing is bound to me, I said aloud, addressing no one and everyone. It used me as a link to remain in this world. Tonight, we sever that link, fully. The villagers stood in silence, their faces illuminated by flickering lantern light. Jinho approached me, his voice low. What happens if this doesn't work? Then the village burns, and the Tengu feeds until there's nothing left, I said flatly. It's the risk we take. He swallowed hard but nodded. The first sign was the wind. It rose suddenly, violent and freezing, whipping through the clearing and scattering the leaves. The lantern flames danced erratically, their light flickering as if afraid of what lurked in the dark. Then came the sound, whoosh. Wings. Hold the line. I shouted, my voice cutting through the rising panic. The villagers tightened the circle, their salt lines glowing faintly under the moonlight. I stood in the center, raising my bloodied dagger toward the heavens. Tengu. I bellowed. I know you hear me. I know what binds you. The forest seemed to shudder. From the darkness, a shadow descended, the Tengu. Its wings spread wide, feathers black as coal. It landed just outside the salt circle, its talons sinking deep into the earth. Its face, twisted and birdlike, regarded me with burning red eyes. Elric, it hissed, my name a whisper on its breath. Your time here ends, I said, steadying my voice, though my heart pounded like a drum. You are not of this land. You are not welcome. The creature tilted its head, its beak curving into something like a grin. You are mine. No, I growled, slashing my palm once more and flinging blood into the air. This bond will break. I cast you back to shadow. The Tengu shrieked, the sound splitting the air and rattling bones. It launched itself at the circle, its claws scraping against the salt barrier with a deafening screech. sparks flew. The villagers cried out, but the line held. Graves! Jinho shouted, gripping his rifle. I ignored him, focusing on the incantation I'd memorized, words pulled from forgotten tomes and whispered warnings. By blood and earth, by shadow and sky, I sever thee. Return to nothing. The Tengu howled, its voice warping into something human, dozens of voices screaming all at once. It clawed at the ground, its eyes locked onto me. I could feel its rage, its hunger, pressing against the barrier. More blood, it hissed. You cannot send me back. I live in you now. For a heartbeat, doubt crept in. Was it right? Had my blood offering bound me forever to this thing? Then Jinho's voice rang out, clear and certain. Finish it, Graves. I looked up, meeting the Tengu's burning eyes. You're wrong, I said, my voice rising. You're not alive. You're nothing. And now you'll return to it. With that, I flung the rest of the blood-soaked salt into the air and completed the incantation. The wind exploded outward, knocking the villagers to the ground. The lantern flames roared, turning blue and blindingly bright. The Tengu screamed, a sound of pure agony, as its form began to unravel. Its wings broke apart like ash caught in the wind, its red eyes dimming to black. It thrashed wildly, clawing at the earth, at the air, at me, but the salt held firm. No, it howled. You cannot. Its words cut off as its body fractured, breaking into spirals of shadow and smoke. The wind carried it upward, scattering the creature into nothingness. And then, suddenly, all was still. The forest sighed. The trees stopped swaying. The lanterns flickered once, then steadied. The Tengu was gone. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. Jinho was beside me in an instant, his face pale but relieved. Is it? It's over, I rasped, staring at the scorched earth where the Tengu had been. The villagers began to rise, their faces a mix of exhaustion and hope. For the first time in weeks, the forest felt quiet. Not empty, but at peace. Minsuk's granddaughter approached me, her small hands clutching a wooden talisman. Thank you, she whispered. I managed a tired smile. Thank your ancestors. They protected you in the end. Jinho and I stood at the edge of the forest as the sun began to rise, spilling gold and pink across the mountains. Will it come back? Jinho asked. No, I said, though I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, the faint whisper of something watching from the trees. Not unless someone invites it again. The land is balanced now, but balance is fragile. Jinho nodded, his face thoughtful. You saved them, Graves. I looked at my bandaged hand, the wound still tender. Some things can't be saved without a price. What about you? I turned to him, offering a faint, weary smile. I'll heal. In time. As I boarded the bus once more, I glanced back at Hanbayan. The village looked almost ordinary now, but I knew better. The land remembered. It always does. I opened my journal, scrawling one last note beneath the entry. The bond is severed, the Tengu banished. A reminder, nothing stolen from the earth comes without a price. Blood feeds the roots. The bus rumbled to life, carrying me back toward Seoul, back to whatever strange horrors awaited next. But as the forest disappeared behind me, the wind picked up once more. For a fleeting moment, I swore I heard it, a whisper, carried on the breeze. Elric. I closed my eyes and ignored it. Some things were better left unheard.